It was a busy morning at New York's LaGuardia Airport. Captain James was preparing for his next flight, a routine trip to Los Angeles. A seasoned pilot, he had seen it all. Today, however, something unexpected was about to happen that would change how he saw the world. Captain James was a tall man, dressed in his uniform, his posture straight and confident. As he walked through the terminal, many people barely noticed him. Most were focused on their own travels. Some travelers gave him brief nods, recognizing the professional look of his uniform, but no one paid him much attention. He was just another pilot, going to work. He made his way to the gate where his flight was waiting. The crew was already there, preparing for the flight. James greeted them with a friendly smile and checked in with the flight attendants, ensuring that everything was in order for a smooth journey. He was no stranger to long hours, but he enjoyed the calm before the storm of the flight. Soon, passengers started to board, and Captain James followed the rest of the crew onto the plane. He was assigned a seat in first class, a luxury he had earned after years of flying. As he settled into his seat, he felt a sense of calm, knowing that this flight would be just like all the others, smooth, with a hint of adventure in the air. However, not long after James got comfortable, a flight attendant approached. She was a young woman, likely in her early 20s. She smiled at him, but there was something about her demeanor that seemed a bit off. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely. "I'm afraid you'll need to move to a different seat. First class is reserved for higher-paying passengers." Captain James was taken aback. He raised an eyebrow, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "I'm sorry," he asked, trying to remain calm. The flight attendant nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll need you to move to coach. First class is not for people like you." For a moment, James stood still, trying to process what had just happened. He knew the flight attendant must have mistaken him for a regular passenger. Perhaps it was the way he was dressed, or maybe she hadn't noticed the gold stripes on his uniform that marked him as a pilot. But there was no excuse for her rude comment. "I am the pilot," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll be staying here." The flight attendant's smile faltered. She blinked a few times, clearly not believing him. "Sir, I don't think you understand," she said, her tone becoming more condescending. "This seat is for higher-class passengers. I'm going to have to ask you to move." James felt his patience thin, but he remained composed. He was used to situations like this, but it didn't make them any easier to handle. He wasn't about to argue with her. Instead, he stood up slowly and offered a polite smile. "I'll be happy to stay in my seat, as I'm the one piloting this flight," he said again, his words carrying an air of authority. The flight attendant hesitated, looking him over one last time. She didn't seem convinced. With a deep breath, she turned and walked away, leaving James to reflect on the strange encounter. As the plane began to fill with passengers, James could feel the eyes of others on him. Some were curious, others amused. He sat back in his seat, trying to shake off the awkwardness. His mind wandered to the bigger picture. How often did people like him, people of color, face unnecessary challenges simply because of how they looked? It wasn't something new, but the incident still stung. But Captain James wasn't one to let it ruin his day. He had a job to do, and nothing was going to stop him from doing it well. As the passengers settled into their seats, Captain James could feel the tension in the air. The flight attendant, who had insisted he move, had disappeared for a moment. But when she returned, she was accompanied by another crew member, a man who seemed more senior. He walked toward James with a stern expression, likely ready to continue the conversation the flight attendant had started. James could sense what was coming. He had dealt with situations like this before, but that didn't make it any easier. The senior crew member smiled politely as he reached James's seat, but there was an underlying tone of authority in his voice. "Sir, I believe there's been some confusion," he said, looking at James with a mixture of concern and confusion. "This is a first-class seat, and it seems you're not supposed to be in this section." Captain James straightened up, his expression calm yet firm. He had learned long ago that staying composed in situations like this was the key to maintaining control. He looked at the senior crew member, then at the flight attendant standing by, waiting for his response. "I'm the pilot of this flight," James said again, his voice steady. "I'll be staying here." The senior crew member paused, clearly unsure how to respond. He glanced at the flight attendant, who was nervously shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. James could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, but he remained calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation any further. The senior crew member opened his mouth to speak but stopped himself. He looked at the flight attendant, his face a picture of uncertainty. Finally, he nodded and turned back to James. "I apologize for the confusion, sir," he said, clearly embarrassed. "We didn't realize who you were." Captain James nodded politely, but there was still a part of him that felt unsettled. Why had the flight attendant assumed he didn't belong in first class? Was it because of the way he looked, or was it just a simple mistake? Either way, it wasn't something he would easily forget. The senior crew member walked away, but the flight attendant remained near James's seat, still visibly uneasy. She avoided eye contact, clearly embarrassed by the entire situation. James glanced at her, but he didn't say anything. The apology was unspoken, but it was clear that she regretted her actions. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, James tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. He had a job to do, and that was his focus now. But the incident had made him think. Even though he had been polite and patient, the flight attendant's actions were still troubling. It was as if she hadn't seen him for who he was, a highly trained professional in charge of the aircraft, not just a regular passenger. The plane lifted off the ground, and the flight began its journey into the sky. James glanced out of the window, watching as the city below became smaller and smaller. But even as he looked out at the clouds, his mind kept drifting back to the awkward encounter. The flight was now in motion, and the tension had eased a little. But James knew that sometimes, even small moments like this could leave a lasting impact. He couldn't ignore what had happened, but he also couldn't let it distract him from his duties. After all, he was there to ensure everyone on board was safe. And that was the most important thing. The flight continued smoothly after takeoff, but the lingering tension from the earlier confrontation stayed in the air. Captain James tried to focus on his duties, checking over the flight plans and making sure everything was running as it should. He could hear the occasional chatter from the flight attendants as they moved through the aisles, and the hum of the plane's engines created a steady background noise. But he couldn't shake the unease caused by the earlier exchange with the flight attendant. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the passengers in first class seemed to settle in. Some were talking, while others were enjoying their drinks or reading. Captain James, in his uniform, sat near the window, quietly observing everything. His mind kept drifting back to the flight attendant. Why had she treated him the way she did? He wasn't the kind of person to hold grudges, but this situation felt different. It wasn't just about being asked to move. It was the way she had spoken to him. Assuming he didn't belong in first class, it was as if she hadn't seen him as someone important, just another face among the crowd. He was, after all, a highly skilled pilot, trusted with the lives of everyone on board. The idea that she hadn't recognized that, or worse, hadn't cared, bothered him. The flight attendant passed by again, glancing at James but quickly looking away. This time, she didn't make eye contact. Captain James noticed her hesitation and couldn't help but wonder if she was avoiding him on purpose. He knew she probably felt embarrassed about the misunderstanding, but there was something more to it. She seemed unsure of what to say, as though she regretted her earlier actions, but didn't know how to make things right. As the plane flew on, the cabin remained calm. The crew moved about, preparing for the next phase of the flight. But when the flight attendant made her way back toward the front of the cabin, Captain James couldn't ignore the strange feeling that lingered. He wasn't looking for an apology, but something about the situation left him feeling unsettled. He had dealt with uncomfortable moments before, But this one felt different. The flight attendant stopped by his seat again, and this time she took a deep breath before speaking. "Captain James," she said quietly, her voice softer than before. "I want to apologize for earlier. I didn't realize who you were, and I made an assumption. That was wrong of me." James turned his head to face her, his expression calm. He could see that she was genuinely sorry. It wasn't easy for someone to admit when they were wrong, especially in front of so many passengers. He nodded slowly, accepting her apology without words. There was no need for a long conversation about it. "I understand," he said after a moment, his voice steady. "Mistakes happen. I appreciate you coming to speak with me." The flight attendant gave him a small, relieved smile before turning to continue her duties. As she walked away, Captain James couldn't help but feel a little lighter. He had been right not to make a scene. The situation was already awkward enough, and now it seemed like it was finally starting to resolve itself. But as the flight continued, Captain James found himself reflecting on the importance of respect and understanding in everyday interactions. It wasn't just about the words spoken or the actions taken. It was about seeing people for who they truly were, not just making assumptions based on appearances. He knew this was a lesson that would stay with him long after the flight was over. As the flight soared above the clouds, Captain James tried to relax. The cabin had settled into a calm rhythm, with the soft hum of the engines providing a comforting background noise. He glanced out of the window, watching the endless expanse of blue sky stretch out before him. His mind, however, kept drifting back to the incident with the flight attendant. Though she had apologized, something still felt off. The moment was far from forgotten, and as the hours passed, Captain James began to notice the reactions of the other passengers. While many seemed absorbed in their own activities, some passengers in first class had clearly been watching the interaction unfold. He couldn't help but wonder how they viewed the situation. One of the passengers, a man who had been sitting in the row across from James, caught his eye. The man gave a slight nod and then leaned toward his seatmate, whispering something that James couldn't quite catch. He had seen the way the passenger had been looking at him earlier, and now he felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, but it was there. The man was looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and surprise. James sighed softly and leaned back in his seat. He had hoped the incident would be forgotten, but it seemed like it was impossible to shake off. As a seasoned pilot, he had faced many challenges in the sky. But this was different. This was a personal challenge, one that touched on issues of respect and perception. It made him think about how people often made assumptions about others based on appearances. Had he been treated this way because of the color of his skin? Had the flight attendant assumed he was just another regular passenger, someone who didn't belong in first class? Before he could dwell on these thoughts for too long, there was a small stir in the cabin. The flight attendant from earlier was moving quickly toward the front of the plane. She wasn't walking with the same confidence she had when she first approached him. This time, she seemed flustered, her steps quick and uncertain. It wasn't hard for James to notice. Her body language was different now. The way she avoided eye contact and kept her head down made it clear that the situation had affected her more than she was willing to admit. As she passed by his seat, she stole a glance at him. Her expression was one of apology, but it was more than just the words she had spoken earlier. There was a look of genuine remorse in her eyes, as though she understood that what had happened was more than a simple mistake. The apology had been necessary, but it wasn't just about being mistaken for someone else. It was about understanding the larger issue, the way people sometimes fail to recognize others for who they truly are. James watched her disappear toward the front of the plane, her movements quick and purposeful. He had no intention of making the situation more uncomfortable for her, but the way she was acting told him that the earlier mistake had left a deeper impression than he had expected. She wasn't just embarrassed by the incident. She was beginning to understand the weight of her actions. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just about a mistake that could be easily brushed off. It was about how the world often judged people by their appearances. The flight attendant, who had assumed he didn't belong in first class, had been making an assumption based on how he looked. For a brief moment, Captain James had felt like he wasn't seen for who he truly was. But in that moment, he also realized something important. He had a chance to change how things were perceived. His calm demeanor, his professionalism, and his ability to remain composed in the face of a difficult situation spoke volumes. This wasn't just about the flight. It was about something bigger. It was about showing people that respect and understanding were key to changing how we saw each other. As the flight continued on its smooth course, Captain James found himself thinking less about the earlier tension and more about the task ahead. He had a job to do. The world outside the airplane was vast and quiet, and inside, everything was calm. The flight attendants had resumed their usual duties, and passengers were settling in for the long journey ahead. For James, the routine was reassuring. It was the comfort of knowing exactly what to expect, of being in control. But the calm didn't last long. Suddenly, the quiet hum of the cabin was interrupted by the sound of an urgent announcement over the intercom. The voice of the captain came through, but this time, it wasn't James. It was the first officer's voice, calling for the attention of the flight crew. "Attention, flight attendants. Please report to the cockpit immediately. We have an urgent matter to address." James immediately sat up straighter in his seat. The words were clear, but the tone was different from the usual announcements. There was an unmistakable sense of urgency in the officer's voice, a hint that something was wrong. His training kicked in, and his mind raced through possible scenarios. Could there be a problem with the aircraft? Was there a medical emergency on board? The flight attendant from earlier, the one who had mistakenly asked James to move, was still near the front of the cabin when the announcement came. James watched as her face changed. The earlier confusion and discomfort she had been feeling were now replaced by a visible sense of anxiety. She looked at the other flight attendants, who seemed equally puzzled, and then quickly moved toward the front of the plane. Her hurried steps echoed in the quiet cabin. As she passed by James's seat, their eyes met briefly. She looked flustered, as though the weight of everything that had happened earlier was pressing down on her. Captain James could see it in her eyes. She knew that she had made a mistake, and now it seemed that the situation was about to get even more complicated for her. Her usual confidence had been replaced by uncertainty, and she wasn't the only one affected. Passengers in first class began to notice the shift in the atmosphere. Some glanced toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendants were heading, while others whispered quietly amongst themselves. The urgency of the announcement had caught everyone's attention, and there was a subtle buzz of curiosity in the air. James knew that this was not a situation to ignore. Something had happened in the cockpit that needed immediate attention. It was rare for a flight to experience such a call, and the seriousness of the moment wasn't lost on him. He glanced at the flight attendants as they made their way to the front, the urgency in their movements impossible to ignore. As the minutes ticked by, James stayed in his seat, patiently waiting to hear more. He couldn't help but wonder what was going on. He trusted the crew, but the tension in the air had shifted. It wasn't just about a small misunderstanding anymore. The flight attendants' earlier actions, though unintentional, seemed to be part of something bigger. The entire situation had created a ripple effect that no one could ignore. Just as the last of the flight attendants disappeared into the cockpit, James felt a familiar sense of responsibility rise within him. Whatever had caused the urgent call needed to be addressed, and quickly. He didn't know what was going on, but he was ready to step in if needed. As a pilot, he was used to handling difficult situations, but this one felt different. The stakes seemed higher now, and James was prepared for whatever might come next. The wait continued, the minutes stretching out, as everyone on board wondered what would happen next. Captain James sat back in his seat, keeping his attention on the situation unfolding in front of him. The flight attendants had all gathered toward the cockpit, leaving the cabin quieter than it had been moments ago. The earlier tension seemed to hang in the air, making the passengers a little more restless than usual. The sudden urgency of the announcement, combined with the uncertainty of what was happening in the cockpit, created a feeling of unease among the crew and passengers alike. James was used to dealing with emergencies, but this was different. He wasn't in the cockpit. He wasn't in control of the situation. He had done everything he could to keep the situation with the flight attendant under control, but now there was something else going on that required attention. The minutes dragged on, and the flight continued its smooth path through the sky. The hum of the engines provided a comforting sound, almost like a lullaby. But the atmosphere inside the cabin remained tense. James knew that, as a pilot, he had to stay focused no matter what. His job was to ensure the safety of everyone on board, and nothing could distract him from that responsibility. He glanced out of the window, trying to clear his mind, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the flight attendant and the awkward confrontation earlier. The whole situation felt strange. She had been so confident at first, so sure that she was right. But now, seeing her face earlier, he knew she was embarrassed, maybe even ashamed of how she had treated him. He couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. As he sat there, reflecting on what had happened, the passengers around him seemed more aware of the strange quiet that had fallen over the flight. Some of them were looking at each other, exchanging glances as they whispered. Others seemed too focused on their own tasks, reading or typing away on their laptops, to notice the shift in the atmosphere. Then, as the minutes passed, there was a soft click from the intercom, followed by the voice of the flight attendant who had been so insistent earlier. She spoke in a calm but clear voice, breaking the silence that had settled over the cabin. "We apologize for the delay, ladies and gentlemen. There has been a minor issue that requires our attention, but we are taking care of it now. Please remain seated and relax. We'll be resuming service shortly." James didn't hear any mention of what the issue was, but the tone of her voice told him everything he needed to know. The flight attendants were dealing with something important, and they had everything under control. There was no need for him to intervene. He leaned back in his seat, finally able to let out a quiet breath. The tension that had been in the air for the past few minutes started to ease. People seemed to settle back into their seats, and the noise of the cabin returned to its usual rhythm. James knew that whatever had happened, the crew had the situation in hand. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where the flight attendants were still busy working. The flight was now in a stable position, and the passengers were mostly at ease again. It was clear that the flight attendants had dealt with whatever had occurred in the cockpit, and everything would be fine. Still, the whole experience had left James with a sense of reflection. He'd kept his calm, but the uncertainty of what had just happened reminded him of the importance of staying focused, even when things were beyond his control. It was a reminder that, in every moment, there was always something unexpected just around the corner. The rest of the flight passed without incident. The crew was focused, the passengers were calm, and the plane continued on its course to Los Angeles. Everything seemed to be back to normal, but for Captain James, it was a moment he wouldn't soon forget. As the flight continued its course, Captain James tried to focus on the tasks at hand. The calm had finally returned to the cabin, and everything seemed to be settling into its normal rhythm. The flight attendants were serving drinks, and the passengers were chatting quietly or watching movies. It felt like the earlier tension had been forgotten by most of the passengers, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the air. Just then, the flight attendant who had made the mistake earlier appeared again, walking down the aisle with a hesitant step. She had a different look in her eyes this time. There was no longer any trace of the firmness or impatience she had shown before. She seemed calmer, more introspective. When she spotted Captain James, her expression softened, and she made her way directly toward him. Captain James sat up straighter in his seat, his eyes meeting hers. He could see that she was about to speak, but he waited, sensing that she had something important to say. "Captain James," she began, her voice quiet but sincere. "I just wanted to apologize again for what happened earlier. I was wrong to assume who you were, and the way I spoke to you was unprofessional." James listened carefully. He could see the genuine remorse in her eyes. The way she spoke showed that she had taken the time to reflect on her actions. He had expected an apology, but there was something in the way she said it that told him this wasn't just about trying to smooth things over. She really understood what had happened, and it seemed like she was truly sorry. "I didn't recognize you as the pilot," she continued, her tone humble. "But that's no excuse for treating you the way I did. I'm embarrassed, and I just want to make it right." James could sense that she was feeling the weight of her actions. He knew how difficult it could be to admit a mistake, especially in front of someone you had wronged. But in this moment, he also knew that her apology was heartfelt. He smiled gently, trying to ease the tension. "I appreciate your honesty," he said, his voice calm and kind. "Mistakes happen, and what matters is that we learn from them. I understand." The flight attendant gave a small, relieved smile, and for the first time since the incident, she looked more at ease. It was clear that she had been carrying the weight of the misunderstanding with her, and now that she had apologized, she seemed lighter. It was a moment of understanding between them, a quiet resolution to an uncomfortable situation. The brief exchange was over as quickly as it had started. The flight attendant nodded politely and turned to continue with her duties, her steps now much lighter than before. James watched her walk away, and for a moment, he thought about how far people could come from a simple misunderstanding. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the awareness that came with it, the ability to reflect on one's actions and grow from them. As the flight continued, Captain James felt a sense of calm wash over him. The incident had been awkward, but it had also been a chance for both of them to learn something. For the flight attendant, it was about recognizing the importance of respect and not making assumptions based on appearances. For James, it was a reminder to remain patient and understanding, no matter the situation. The rest of the flight passed without further incident, and as they neared Los Angeles, the atmosphere in the cabin was light and relaxed once again. Everyone seemed content, unaware of the small drama that had unfolded earlier. For Captain James, however, it was a reminder of how easily misunderstandings could arise, and how important it was to handle them with grace and understanding. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Captain James leaned back in his seat, letting out a quiet breath. The day had been long, but it was nearly over. The flight had gone smoothly after the earlier tension had cleared, and the passengers seemed content as they prepared for arrival. The hum of the engines was steady, and the seatbelt signs flickered on as the plane began to lower its altitude. James watched as the flight attendants moved through the aisles, making sure everyone was ready for landing. He noticed that the flight attendant who had caused the earlier confusion seemed much more at ease now. Her steps were lighter, and there was no trace of the discomfort she had shown earlier. It seemed that the apology had lifted a weight from her shoulders. James reflected on the events of the day. It wasn't just about what had happened on the plane. It was about the bigger picture. The misunderstanding had been uncomfortable, yes, but it had also sparked something inside him. He had been calm through the whole situation, not letting the tension get to him, and the flight attendant had recognized her mistake and corrected it. That was important. But what had struck him the most was how quickly things had turned around, how one small apology could change everything. It made him think about how often people jump to conclusions based on appearances. In his case, the flight attendant had assumed he didn't belong in first class simply because of how he looked. It wasn't an intentional insult, but it was still an assumption that had made things difficult. However, once she realized who he truly was, everything shifted. It was a reminder of how important it was to treat people with respect, no matter what their background was. As the plane continued its descent, James couldn't help but think about the passengers too. Many of them had seen what had happened. While most had probably moved on, there was a chance that some of them had taken something from the situation. Maybe they hadn't fully understood the depth of it, but perhaps they'd realized, just like the flight attendant had, that it's easy to misjudge someone based on first impressions. James's thoughts were interrupted as the plane touched down smoothly on the runway. The sudden shift in the plane's motion reminded him that the flight was nearly over. He quickly turned his attention back to the task at hand, landing the plane safely. His job wasn't finished yet, and it was time to focus on guiding the plane to the gate. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The flight had been without incident, the passengers were safe, and everything had gone well. It was moments like these that made him proud of his work. He had handled the situation with grace, and though it had been uncomfortable, he knew he had done the right thing by staying calm. Once the plane came to a full stop, James stood up and began to prepare for his final duties. The passengers began to gather their things, and the cabin buzzed with the usual chatter that followed every successful flight. Before he left the cockpit, he glanced back at the flight attendants one last time. The woman who had apologized earlier gave him a small nod of thanks as she went about her duties. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to let him know that the lesson had been learned, not just by her, but by everyone who had witnessed the exchange. As the crew prepared to leave the plane, Captain James walked down the aisle, his mind clearer than it had been all day. The day's challenges had passed, and he was ready to take on whatever came next. The plane had finally reached the gate, and the passengers began to gather their belongings. It had been a long flight, but everything had gone smoothly in the end. Captain James stood in the cockpit for a moment longer, watching as the crew prepared to exit. He let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of the long day slowly lift off his shoulders. As he made his way down the aisle toward the exit, he noticed the flight attendant who had apologized earlier. She was smiling, talking to a colleague, but her demeanor was different now. There was no longer any tension in her posture. It seemed that the apology had not only relieved her, but had also helped her grow. James made his way through the cabin, giving the passengers a nod as they made their way out. Some of them looked at him with the quiet respect that pilots often get. Others were just focused on getting to their next destination. The usual bustle of a completed flight filled the air, and it almost felt like everything that had happened earlier had been forgotten. As he reached the door to the jet bridge, Captain James paused. He turned to look one last time at the flight attendants as they wrapped up their duties. The woman who had caused the earlier discomfort was standing by the exit now, finishing a few last tasks. She caught his eye and smiled, her face relaxed and at ease. James smiled back, feeling a quiet sense of closure. The incident that had begun with a mistake had ended with mutual understanding. Outside, the terminal was busy as always. The bright lights and the bustling sounds of the airport felt almost like a different world from the calm in the sky. But even with the hectic atmosphere around him, James felt calm. The day had been full of lessons about respect, understanding, and the importance of seeing beyond the surface. He had learned something too. Even though he had been the one at the center of the misunderstanding, James realized how important it was to handle such situations with patience and respect. The flight attendant had acted out of a moment of uncertainty, but she had taken the time to recognize her mistake and apologize. That showed growth. That showed that we are all capable of learning from our actions. As Captain James left the plane and walked through the airport, his thoughts stayed with him. This flight had been different from all the others. It wasn't just about flying from one place to another. It was about what happened in between. He had seen firsthand how misunderstandings can be resolved with simple kindness, and how important it is to treat others with dignity, no matter who they are. It wasn't always easy to navigate these situations, but he had learned that it was always worth the effort. As he made his way to the crew room, he thought about the passengers and the flight attendants, how the flight had ended on a note of understanding. In the end, that was what mattered most. Captain James had done his job well, not just as a pilot, but as a person. And that, he realized, was something to be proud of. It was a quiet end to a long day, but it was one filled with meaning. As the airport's lights flickered in the distance, Captain James smiled to himself. The journey had ended, but the lessons learned would stay with him for a long time.